about NATO?
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the panel, The Violent Imagination of Financial Capitalism, second day of the conference today. And as you have already heard and read, the title of the festival and the conference, of course, is following it, is Face Value. And with it, we wish to address the crisis of politics, values, and meanings in today's economized and polarized world. What we try to do is, in a way, to revisit the relation of capitalism to racism and of neoliberalism to fascism in order to underline how processes of value creation and capital accumulation involve the exploitation of differences. Now, within this context, we are, of course, specifically also looking into the dissymmetries of neoliberalism and the ways with which financialization invades all sectors of life. Two, in a way, classic references lie behind the title and the theme of this panel. The first is Karl Marx's notion of fictitious capital, and the second one is Frantz Fanon's thought on the violence of colonial racism. Now, these references have been used to discuss the ways that capital finds always ways to reinvent itself, but to also ask how its different forms of violence can be opposed. As a moderator of this panel, we're very happy to have with us Amel Ouaïssa, who is a sociologist, and her interests lie on post-colonial and decolonial theories, feminist theory, and societal and political transformation in the Middle East and North Africa region. She's also pursuing a PhD on this topic. Amel is also a political activist and a member of the Working Group for Anti-Racism and Intercultural Affairs of the Berlin Advisory Council for Migration and Integration. Before leaving the stage, I would like to thank Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung for their support to the conference program. Thanks very much, and please welcome Amel and our speakers.
Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to this panel on the violent imagination of financial capitalism. And thank you very much, Daphne, for the introduction. So my name is Amel Ouaïssa, and I'm very happy to be moderating this panel today here at Transmediale Face Value. To give you an idea on how we thought to proceed today, I shall begin with a short introduction of this which should not take longer than 5 to 7 minutes. And then I would introduce today's speakers, Nina Power, Max Haiven, Larry Achiampong, and David Blandy, and hand over to them. Their inputs will be about 15 minutes each, which should leave us with 30 minutes for discussion at the end. We would love to open the discussion in the second half, so please do feel invited to ask your questions via these two microphones. I hope you see them there and there. And yeah, so today's panel is to be situated in the broader theme of the transmediale face value Daphne just has elaborated on. And while reading the overarching topic of the transmediale face value, I had to think about an outcry that Josie Fanon, Frantz Fanon's belated wife, voiced while witnessing the violence shaking Algiers in October 1988. She was standing at a window and talking on the phone to a friend and watching how protesting youth got beaten up, like severely beaten up by police forces And that's when she uttered, "Ô France, the wretched of the earth again." And I think if Josie Fanon was alive today to witness the tragedies taking place at the borders of the European Union these days, with 10,000s of people risking all in the hope for a life without oppression, hunger, and war, she would, or she might do so again. I mean, the hope the people who are trying to come here have proves, like sadly, proves elusive most of the time, as many of them die while trying to reach the promised lands. And those who succeed are often met with scorn, suspicion, and racism. Nowadays, we face, or we have to listen, we are obliged to listen to contentious debates on viable solutions to the so-labeled refugee crisis. These debates actually shape the overall political climate within the member states of the EU. And these are accompanied by a prevailing fear-mongering pertaining to the loss of a national identity or a European identity, and the risk of poverty. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the United States, we do have Donald Trump that does not cease to surprise us or to shock us. Trump's political agenda is one of neoliberalism par excellence, and it is not only a concern or a matter of concern to people living in the United States, but to all of us who live in a globalized world. The tense atmosphere we are currently experiencing certainly stems from multiple reasons and factors that leverage one another. However, what seems to loom in debates like changing migration laws to prevent particular individuals or particular groups from entering a country, or speeding up asylum procedures to expulse economic refugees, is not only the widespread myth of the so-called West or global North that has reached modernity and on its own, but it's also it really shows that nowadays, probably more than ever, the value of an individual is, or the value that is being ascribed to an individual is depending on on the individual's political capital, economic capital, and cultural capital. And the unequal distribution of these forms of capital are being, of course, picked up by far-right groups and parties who incorporate these in their populist and racist discourses. And the face of the value of the face, the value of a nation, of a race or a gender, are being incorporated and instrumentalized for their political agendas. It is, are you checking my notes? Yeah. Their ideas, I'm sticking to the script. So the ideas, the racist and populist ideas of far-right groups are being heard and absorbed and disseminated through racialized technologies. In these times of corporate authoritarianism, it is capitalism that is conscripting people's imagination and safety needs. And in fact, as Daphne also stated earlier, it is in this continuous relationship to imagination that capitalism succeeds in securing and prolonging itself. The imagination to control risks, to leverage potential, and to maximize profit. So we are dealing with fictitious divisions based on the imagination of social categories such as race, nation, gender, heteronormativity, ability. And these socially constructed categories have assisted in the development of an unequal progress. And in fact, if we consider the relationship between colonialism and capitalism, these socially constructed categories actually are the central elements structuring all relations of exploitation and domination these days. For it was in this context of colonialism and the invention of a new control of labor and resources and enslavement that already existing capitalism got intrinsically tied to these other moments of exploitation and domination. And today, I mean, I'm trying to build a bridge, colonialism today. Such notions as speculation and risk do not only describe processes of financialization or processes of financial capitalism, but also the social realities of the vast majority of the global population. So to put it in a nutshell, we seem to face modern problems to which we don't have, or there aren't modern solutions. And it seems that the time has come to leave our ideas about modernity and capitalism behind, to come full circle, and in order to understand, obviously, the global problems we are facing today, and to try to find solutions to them. This is why this panel today is going to address the main question this panel is going to address today is how can capitalism be reimagined if it always succeeds to reinvent itself, and can the answer to its violence, this economic and structural violence, be, to borrow a term by aforementioned Frantz Fanon, counter-violence? Luckily, I'm just here to raise questions today and leave the answers or the approaches to others. So I'm very pleased to introduce Max Haiven, who's going to have his first input today. Max is a writer, educator, movement organizer, and Canada Research Chair for Culture, Media, and Social Justice at Lakehead University. He's a very busy man. He's also director of the Reimagining Value Action Lab. Max writes articles for both general and academic audiences. His research focuses on processes of financialization, particularly with regards to societies and culture. And he has authored the books Crisis of Imagination, Crisis of Power, Cultures of Financialization, and co-authored the book The Radical Imagination. I'll leave the floor to you, Max.
Thank you so much. Nice to see everyone. What I'm going to do today, quite briefly, is begin by situating myself between two unpayable debts and where I think my approach to financialization and the imagination comes from. Then I want to tell you a little bit about the way I've been thinking about the relationship between financialization and imagination in my past work, and then sketch for you some new work I'm doing on the relationship between financialization and settler colonialism, and the reason why I think will become clear in a moment. So I want to start by situating myself as a body and as an individual between two debts. I am the product of reparations. My grandfather was given reparations for most of his natural life. I never met him. He died before I was born because he was a Holocaust survivor, and he migrated to Canada. And those reparations allowed him, essentially, to cut a very long story short, to make my family white. Essentially, had he arrived 20 or 30 years prior to Canada, he would have been considered a racialized person, given the racialized schema in place in the settler colony of Canada at the time. After the Second World War, after he migrated to Canada, he was able to enter into Canadian society and participate as essentially a white person, an ethnicized white person with an accent, but a white person. He was able to send my father to university. My father was able to accumulate social, economic, and other forms of capital to send me to university. And so I take quite seriously the question of forms of racialized violence and how they pass down through generations, and how some unpayable debts become paid in certain financialized ways under capitalism, and how some unpayable debts are erased under capitalism. And the second way I'd like to situate myself is by speaking about myself as a colonizer, because as a citizen of the settler colonial state of Canada, I occupy stolen Indigenous land. All the water I drink, all of the resources that I cultivate that allow me to reproduce myself, my community, and my life are stolen. And there's a dialectic here that I feel quite acutely, and I want to sensitize myself to, that on one hand, I'm the product of reparations for an unpayable debt for the crimes of essentially the evolution of racialized capitalism into fascism, on the one hand, but I'm also the beneficiary of unpayable debts to Indigenous people of Canada whose land and resources have been stolen at great cost to their communities and their livelihoods and their capabilities for autonomous social reproduction. We'll come back to the question of settler colonialism at the end. With that as a framing, I want to talk a little bit about my concern about financialization in the past, and I've been influenced by many thinkers who've been trying to frame financialization as more than just an economic phenomenon, which is the increased power of the financial sector, the so-called FIRE sector for finance, insurance, and real estate, over the global economy. That much, I think, by now is fairly obvious, that huge investment banks, hedge funds, and other financial interests hold this incredible sway over economic actors. But also to frame financialization as a political fact, in the sense that increasingly governments come under the incredible influence and pressure of the financial sector, and governments begin to act in financialized ways, that policy is increasingly set through a sort of generation of speculative value. Third, that financialization is a sociological phenomenon in the sense that it is transforming all of the institutions of society away from any notion of collective care or the public good, as problematic as those may have been under Keynesianism and previous moments of colonialism and imperialism. But in any case, towards a neoliberal notion where everything is an investment, where the profit is to be maximized, usually by those who've made the investments. And third, the idea that financialization is a cultural transformation as well, that financialization on some level means the shifting of all our imaginations towards transforming ourselves into financialized subjects, such that even coming to a conference, meeting someone interesting, having an intellectual discussion, all of these in the back of our minds, we're haunted by the idea that these are investments that we're making in our human capital, in our career, in our cultural capital, blah, 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 blah. You know the critique. So financialization is much broader and much deeper than we thought it was. And this has led me to think about the relationship between financialization and the imagination in three frames. So the first frame is to think about the incredible magic by which the entire world comes under the sway of Imagineers in the head offices of investment banks around the world, who are hallucinating figments of their imagination, called credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, derivative contracts, securities, etc., etc. And yet these completely imaginary constructs have incredible sway over global life. Today, the majority, perhaps, of global commodities, which are the base materials, the foodstuffs, the minerals that circulate around the world, the prices and the movements of those very basic elements of our human civilization, if we can call it that, are determined by speculative investments. We know of the warehouses of grains and of other base minerals that simply sit unchanged for years as the rights to them move around the world. So this is an incredible triumph of the human imagination in the worst possible way. And I'm fascinated by the way that in the financial sector itself, they can begin to sort of share this dream, which is the nightmare for all the rest of us. And that dream holds. It may for them be this technocratic moment, this cultural moment of hallucinating value and ascribing symbolic value to real things. For most of the rest of us, to varying levels and varying degrees, it manifests as a form of extreme violence in our lives. So in this first case, financialization of the imagination hides incredible violence, violence which travels along the same routes, the same river systems, the same ports as colonial violence that built the financialized regime that we live in today. The second way I'm thinking about the financialization of the imagination is about what it does to all of us, which I mentioned a moment ago when I was speaking about the culture of financialization, the influence of financialization on our self-perception, on our activities, and the sense that we all are increasingly transformed by the system of financialization into miniature financiers, to consider every aspect of our life, from education to culture to healthcare to exercise to even our most intimate relationships, as investments, as gambles, as gambits. And in a world where care is being destroyed, where whatever modicum of care that might have once been provided to some of us by the state is being stripped away by neoliberalism, increasingly all of our imaginations become financialized. And finally, the third frame of the financialization of the imagination gets a little weird, and that's where I've tried to theorize in some way finance, the sphere of finance, as the imagination of capital itself. And I don't really have time to get into all of the dimensions of what I mean there, but David Harvey, the great Marxist geographer, posits that the financial sector acts as the central nervous system of capitalism. It's a place where all of the signals from around the body of capital flow into the quote-unquote brain, and then the brain sends signals back to the body to adjust movement, and there's a sort of feedback loop. And I have suggested that maybe while the brain is a fitting metaphor, maybe the imagination is a better metaphor, in part because it helps us explain how weird things get up there in capital's brain, if you accept the metaphor, in part because it also helps explain the relationship between capital's transformations towards what some have termed cognitive capitalism and its influence and dependence on its transformation of our imaginations as well. This is research I've been doing over the last few years, but I've become dissatisfied precisely because I've been grappling with this question of myself being a colonizer living in a colonial settler state. In fact, the colonial settler state funds my research. So there's an irony there that is not lost on me. I also recently moved to a small city in Canada called Thunder Bay. You've probably never heard of it. It's the murder capital of Canada. It's one of the poverty capitals of Canada, but that murder and the violence, incredible violence of this town, is almost 100% directed towards the 20% of the population who are indigenous Anishinaabe or Cree people in that city. So the violence of capitalism is extremely present in my life. It's extremely present also in the economy of the space of Thunder Bay, which is really one of Canada's extractive frontiers for mining minerals. And so I briefly want to go over, in the short time that remains to me, a kind of counter-history of financialization that would add colonialism and settler colonialism back in. And I think we can go back to the economic definition of the financial sector as being based on finance, insurance, and real estate. So finance here refers to high finance, joint stock corporations, investment banks, hedge funds. Well, we know that the first joint stock corporations were incorporated in Holland and England in order to facilitate colonialism. For instance, the Hudson Bay Corporation, which was founded in the early 1600s in London, was created explicitly as a joint stock corporation so that proto-capitalists could share the risk of colonizing the nation that we now know of as Canada. And similar phenomenon, of course, occurred with the East India companies and all sorts of other companies that were not necessarily the direct imposition of sovereignty, but were in fact the original private-public partnerships of empire, where investors essentially were facilitated by the nation-state in order to invest in colonialism. This is the origin of many of the financial technologies which today haunt the globe. Second, the insurance industry. As people like Ian Balcom and others have shown us, the modern insurance industry was born in the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. It was a way of commodifying and financializing the bodies of African people so that regardless if those African bodies made it to the quote-unquote New World alive or not, they would be profitable to their quote-unquote owners. That is the origin in mercantile insurance of the modern insurance industry. And the real estate sector as well. And this is a slightly more tangential or more difficult argument to make, but I would point to the work of Indigenous Australian scholar Aileen Morton Robinson, who points out that today's notions of private property cannot be detached from the ways that colonialism, settler colonialism to be specific, was facilitated by enfranchising people we now understand to be white, colonists, with private property. That was not something that was brought over necessarily from Europe, but something that was experimented with. The laboratory was the settler colony for offering colonists this resource in order to purchase their loyalty and their fidelity to the sovereign colonial force. So with these origins of financialization and colonialism now entangled, I have sort of three questions that I'm asking about really my own situatedness on the extractive, colonial, and financialized frontier in Canada. And one of them is the question about whether the financialized subjectivity that we speak about when we're talking about financialization, this idea of being an investor in yourself, whether we can't offer an alternative genealogy of that doesn't just begin in 1973 with Nixon going off the gold standard, the sort of conventional arguments about when financialization began, but instead say that perhaps the settler and the colonial settler was the original financialized subject, the original site of investment, the original subject who became the bearer of a certain type of hope, a certain type of gamble that was made jointly by the nation state and by the financialized apparatus in order to settle land and claim it for colonial exploitation. The second question I have is whether and how the notions of risk management, which are so present in the discourses of financialization today, might also have their origin in the settler colonial paranoia and urge to police and control the body of the colonized and the social body of the colonized. Whether that encounter of the colonist with the unimaginable and uncalculatable risk of rebellion and resistance of the colonized is in fact the hidden source of the discourses and technologies of risk management that are so present today, not only in the financial sector, but also in the technology sector as well. And the third question I would ask is about how, to go back to what I began with, which is this question of situating myself between two unpayable debts. The one hand, the unpayable debt of the Holocaust, which, as we should always remember, and Aimé Césaire pointed out, was in some ways, some very crucial ways, the return of European colonial violence to Europe. So in some ways, can we speak about, I'm thinking about the unpayable debt of that event. I'm thinking about the unpayable debt that situates me as a settler colonist in Canada and the beneficiary of that system. And thinking about the way that debts in the global economy, drawing on the work of Denis de Ferreira da Silva and Paula Chakravarty, some debts and some investments are intended to make certain subjects richer. They're intended to bear fruit. They're intended to be a risk that is taken to enliven certain subjects, to allow them to participate in a financialized society. But they pointing to the subprime crisis in the United States, which was the single largest destruction of black wealth in American history since Reconstruction. In the context of that, they say that some investments are intended to continue to make certain subjects doomed. That in their metaphor, it is not to invest to allow someone to get a house in order to allow them to have sort of a personal capital in order to build up their life, as my grandfather did with the reparations he received from Germany, right? He bought a house, he was able to use the investment in the house to leverage an education for his son, and on, such that my family inherited the privileges of whiteness to the person you see sitting before you today. For other people, that investment cycle works the other direction, where generation after generation is subjected to exploitative and extractive debts, which continue to perpetuate forms of racialized doom. And that's the situation I feel in many ways that I live in a place called Thunder Bay, in a country that has officially dedicated itself to overcoming its colonial legacy, that announces itself on the world stage, that is Canada, to be dedicated to a reconciliation, and yet which underneath that is also one of the drivers as a G8 economy of a financialized system which is actively destroying Indigenous life and the lives of many, many racialized people around the world. So these are the sorts of questions I'm thinking about, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Max. So let me introduce our next speakers, Larry Achiampong and David Blandy. Larry and David share an interest in popular culture and the post-colonial position, which also manifests in their collaborative work. In this, you examine the personal heritage using performances, devising alter egos to point at your and ours divided selves. And in one of your artworks, which really caught my attention, was the Finding Fanon series, which is also displayed here at the Transmediale today, in which you explore the post-colonial condition and situation within a simulated space, namely the Grand Theft Auto 5 game, which I thought is actually amazing. It's an amazing idea. So together, you're welcome. Together, you have displayed, performed, and showcased your artworks in many different places and spaces. Here in Berlin at Savvy Contemporary, and Tate Modern London, and Modern Art Oxford. So yeah, I'm very much looking forward to your input.
Thank you, Amel. And thank you, Max. That was incredible. But we are artists. We're not academics. So,
good to make that clear.
But what we do in our practice is that we try to take our friendship, our relationship, I guess, in a way, and then look at it as look at ourselves as anthropological subjects. So, you know, how did we come to be friends in this situation, and how does the whole legacy of colonialism and our situation inside neoliberal capitalism, how does that impact on our friendship, and how, in fact, is our friendship possible inside this construct? And the series that I guess deals with that relationship the most clearly is our Finding Fanon series, where we were looking to try and find the 3 lost plays of psychiatrist and theorist Frantz Fanon. Do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, in terms of Fanon's ideas and practice, it was quite a huge impact on me, not simply as an artist, but actually just as a young black male, working class, living and growing up in London. So I guess that impact that Fanon's writings, particularly Black Skin, White Mask, had made on me, I guess at a point in time when certain experiences of racism I wasn't really able to locate through kind of pinpointing for a specific type of word or phrasing, Fanon managed to open up for me. This is kind of, I guess, early 2000s, kind of after 9/11, particularly when this kind of, I guess, this increase of racialized violence would kind of, you know, go through London, as it were. I guess what's really interesting for me about the conversation, and I'd say unfinished conversation, quoting Professor Stuart Hall about mine and David's work, is our interest in looking directly at ourselves within a mirror and questioning our own position within, I guess, the 2 kind of shades of the colonial coin, really. David coming from a middle-class background as a white person, me coming from a black and working-class background. But specifically, I guess, our familial stories. I won't kind of go into those deeply, because I think you can experience that through the works that are on show. But at the beginning of the Finding Fanon project, both David and I, we interviewed members of our family. So I interviewed my uncle, whom, to give you a bit of a kind of like background to my own family and their existence within the UK, during the late 70s, early 80s, travelled to the UK. Pretty much all of my family, they're all paperless migrants. And members of my family, including my uncle, were interred within asylum-seeking detention centres. Pretty much prisons. If any of you have been to a prison before, or you've checked out an asylum-seeking detention centre, I don't think there's really much of a difference, particularly with the experience of individuals not really having much or knowledge, particularly when it comes to asylum-seeking detention centres, when they'll be released, how long they'll be held for, you know, why they're being held, etc. This was a conversation that my uncle didn't really want to talk about much. My family didn't really want to talk about either, and quite simply because of the presentation of migrants through the media as vermin, as animals, that type of thing, and that obviously through the decades has kind of resurfaced in recent news stories. David, do you want to perhaps talk a little bit about the familial kind of story that you brought from your grandfather?
In contrast to Larry's experience, my grandfather taught horticultural methods in Kenya, how to grow pineapples as a cash crop, in order to can them and send them back to England as a kind of tasty dessert, like pineapples in syrup. And so they taking this crop from South America, growing it in Kenya, in order to, there was a specific plan, a Swinnerton plan it was called, which was to build up a black middle class in order to create internal suppression of the lower classes in Kenya in order there wasn't a Mau Mau rebellion. But the plan didn't work. Kenya was soon no longer a colony, but he was doing that work at that time. And really this working on this project was the first time that I directly talked to my grandfather about that situation. And it was interesting. It was really interesting. He in the end he said that, everything that we did was shit, which is quite something coming from a 90-year-old, quite posh guy. But they were working with what's that chemical DCP, the one that kind of just kills bees and stuff. But they were introducing that as well at the time. That was like the wonder thing. In order to grow pineapples in that situation, you had to use lots of pesticides, etc. So it was pretty bad all round. But as we were going through this experience of our two kind of, as Larry says, two sides of the coin of colonialism, and yet here we are having this conversation. We're both growing up in London. We're both speaking the same slang from the schoolyard. We're both now artists, and both play video games. And all of these things somehow,
very important.
How do these friendships come together? The number of friendships that I've formed through online communities, etc., that are transnational, transracial. It's kind of an interesting space. So when it came to our second film, it made sense to move into the virtual environment to start talking about these things. And why not take a game that is renowned for a system of violence, systematic violence, to talk about cultural violence? And and so we used Grand Theft Auto 5.
Yeah, I mean, initially we toyed with the idea of utilizing the video game Fallout. That felt a bit too kind of post-apocalyptic. The game engine for Skyrim, Elder Scrolls, that just felt too Nordic. It's a bit too white. But with Grand Theft Auto, you have this kind of incredible soup of culture, whether that's music, landscapes, people, even if they are problematically represented, whether that's to do with gender, race, and class. Pretty much a development team that's middle, upper class, male, white, talking about gang culture in LA. I mean, how do you do that? And this was really important, I guess, for the development of the work, even when we were creating our own avatars. So this is one summer, I guess, in 2015, David and I, we built these PCs that we're going to use to be able to communicate and kind of film the characters through the landscapes. I'd noticed very early on, I was able to create David's character in, 20 minutes, half an hour.
Well, I'm basically default, yeah?
Yeah, you are default. Default white male. I'm glad you recognize. Me, on the other hand, as you can notice my beautiful long locks here, and if you go into the booths, I have generic dreadlocks. A really interesting essay, actually, by Evan Narcisse, who writes a lot about black culture in relation to video games, who talks about there being pretty much like 5 main hairstyles for black characters within video games. That's the regular afro, the short fade, dreadlocks, cornrows, and then another variation of a fade. So you can notice my my anger at kind of noticing, like, in such a expansive, massive video game open world, probably one of the largest open worlds within a video game, that I wasn't able to get long locks. I was able to create you, David, but I couldn't do myself. So areas like that we wanted to, I guess, exploit through this game. But I think by the time we'd come to the, kind of the end of production of Fanon 2, we'd noticed that as much as we wanted to continue this story, this conversation between two individuals, but how that connects on a globalized scale, that we couldn't simply just continue to tell that story through our own perspectives, even if that was bringing in Haley Joy Rose, who incredibly managed to narrate the whole trilogy. So we'd noticed that, in a way, we'd kind of created, I guess, a methodology of bringing together visuals from a video game in a kind of open source manner, the development of script through just direct testimony, really, and then also the ability to create soundtracks without the use or need of a large studio. In terms of my upbringing in Bethnal Green, I think it's, again, kind of important to note my experience of being inspired by my family, who would take me to church when I was a kid, but also at the same time being surrounded by people who are creating grime beats and garage, which would, of course, be noted as grime. So we had these three kind of pillars or strands that we felt would be really important to maybe bring towards other members of the public, not simply just nationally, but internationally. So I guess what kind of proceeded from there was the Finding Fanon Gaiden project. David, maybe.
Yeah. Gaiden's a terminology from manga and anime culture in Japan, which means side story. 5 minutes, thanks. It's basically it's taking, rather than the main characters from the program, it looks at the minor characters or alternate characters inside that universe and how those might proceed. So we worked with a whole series of different communities. We worked, I think the first one was with veterans of mostly the Iraq War, who were now in the criminal justice system, in prison in Liverpool for thanks to their brutalization by the whole military system, and them telling their stories. We had to effectively smuggle PlayStation 4s into the prison in order to get that made.
Which isn't easy.
Yeah, and then we worked with paperless migrants in Oslo in order to tell their stories, and I think that's where we should show where.
Yeah, I think so. But I think also quickly kind of adding to this point and the question around violence and its relationship with capitalism. I think most people may kind of note Brexit kind of taking place as the kind of main example, but I think also even considering the Grenfell disaster, the understanding that around under 100 individuals have been apparently accounted for, yet we're talking about a building that would have housed up to 600 people. A tragedy which could have easily been avoided by a borough which is one of the richest in the world. They have reserves of over 270 million, which is just ridiculous. So I think when life is kind of treated on that kind of monetary or kind of value, we're literally talking about murder. You can't kind of get any more black and white than that. So I guess without further ado, let's play an example of one of the Gaiden stories.
I came here 11 years ago. I stayed in the reception center for 3 years without any answer. But they gave me a work permit. So I was working as a cleaner, and after 3 years my application was rejected. They gave me a lawyer, and I applied again, and was denied. I waited a long time and received no answer. My work permit expired and my employer asked me to renew it. When I applied for the permit, I was told that there was a final decision, rejection. They forgot me for 3 years, and then again for another year, and only when I applied for the work permit did they remember me sending the decision of rejection. After the second rejection, my employer didn't want me to work there, as I didn't have a permit. After the last rejection, they said I had to leave this country, and I couldn't work. I survived 1 year on the money I had saved from working before. After a year, I couldn't afford rent, so I started to live with friends and my network. I'm afraid to go back to my country. I have been politically active. I want to see democracy in Ethiopia. Supporting an organization for a political party puts me in danger. Because of this, I am afraid to return to Ethiopia. And now, everyone is afraid of being sent by force to Ethiopia. Politicians are selling us for their purposes. Innocent people are being tortured and killed. So many people are in prison. They have no rights of speech. We are afraid of what will happen if we go back. I survived to get to Europe. Why do they want to send us back to this place? I am a woman and I am morally tortured. Instead of having a life, a family, children, I have nothing. I cannot marry. I cannot have children. I've stayed here for a long time and now I can't work. I am a woman whose age is running away. It is hopeless. No one will marry you if you are dependent on someone. No one wants you. It's a bad feeling.
Thank you very much, Larry and David. Also for breaking it down. Like from bringing it from the structural level to this very personal level. And yeah, so allow me to introduce our last speaker for today. Last but not least, Nina Power. Nina is a cultural critic, social theorist, philosopher, and translator. She's a senior lecturer at Roehampton University, senior lecturer in philosophy. Nina authored the book One Dimensional Woman and has a wide range of research interests. She has written on politics, feminism, philosophy, and culture. And Nina's also writing a lot of articles for The Wire, The Guardian, etc. It's your stage.
Thank you for that introduction, and it's nice to be here. I find these sorts of rooms without windows quite difficult, and they're just like courtrooms a little bit, but also this kind of weirdness of the impersonality or the impersonal quality of having a discussion or trying to present ideas where you don't get any of the kind of normal feedback that you would get. So I don't know why I mentioned that, but I think I'm a bit nervous, and it reminded me of this. I went to see Leonard Cohen, I think, because you're Canadian. I remembered this, but I went to see him, and it was when, his accountant stole all of his money, and although he was quite elderly, he had to go back on the road and tour, and it was amazing. But I saw him give a performance at one of these really impersonal venues, and he said this beautiful thing at the beginning where he said, speaking to you from the other side of intimacy, and this thing about, he couldn't reach the audience, and I don't know, whatever. He also, obviously, Leonard Cohen has this amazing line about, there is a war between those who think there is a war and those who think there isn't, which I feel is a kind of very guiding maxim that I think about all the time. And what does it mean to recognize a war, and which war? Are we talking about a class war, a war on humanity, a war against groups of people? And what does it mean to be able, I suppose, to be able to not recognize violence and not to recognize that there is a war happening or multiple wars happening, And I think about this line a lot. And I suppose in relation to this question that we're talking about, this sort of imagination of financial capitalism. And at the rally the other night, I was trying to talk a little bit in that very brief time about this idea of decapitalism, which is like an attempt to try and fuse the kind of anti-capitalist oppositional politics, the holding up the mirror to the state and to state violence, and to an analysis of a different kind of way of being alive, to live together, you know, that combination of antagonism and a sort of positive vision, but also a kind of recognition of who has all the stuff, you know, where is the power, where's the money, where's it all gone? You know, there is more than enough stuff for everybody. It's being hidden. And I think this kind of question about what we're allowed to see is maybe what I want to talk about a little bit, is this thing about who gets to hide and who gets to be seen, and what images, you know, we're being shown, and what effect they have on us, I suppose. And this is a weird question because it's a sort of, it starts to seem a little bit moralistic, like I'm not talking about censorship or anything like that, but it might seem a little bit like that. But I think we have to think, like the work you're doing with video games and so on, about the sort of impact and the effect that images have, and you know, whether we're talking about pornography or the pornography of certain capitalist imagination, you know, and the way at the same time that the ruling class get to hide in gated communities, they get to hide their wealth, they get to kind of keep it in these different places, and everyone doesn't have access to it. And I think one of the kind of major ideological images that capitalism presents of itself is of this sort of personless world of kind of electric flows, and, you know, it's permanently on, this kind of streaming wires of, like, you know, excitement, you know, where the sort of movement of people and goods and production and work, you know, whether it's the care work or, you know, keeping people alive, whether it's the work of, like, you know, mining, the kind of resources that are used to make, you know, these things that we then start to think of as immaterial somehow when they're the most material, you know, disappear from sight. So capitalism's own image of itself is of this almost like personless, you know, world in which everything is permanently on, everything is permanently connected, but it's not the kind of connection that we want to talk about, or it's difficult using this we in the way, but I suppose we need to oppose, I suppose, like our own images, our own conceptions of a connected, or, you know, communist internationalism or something that's predicated on something different from that kind of electric excitement, the permanently on image, you know, that we get from the internet, we get of financial capitalism. And this idea that we're supposed to feel permanently bad about the economy. You know, if the economy is depressed, like, we should feel depressed. You know, why is the economy, like, given this kind of personalization when human beings are treated so appallingly? And, you know, I really want to emphasize what Larry said about murder and social murder. And Engels coined this term to describe the way in which poor people and, you know, are destroyed and killed by capitalism and destroyed by financial capital. And, you know, Grenfell really was that. And it was, you know, along with austerity in Britain, which has been extreme as a political project, we have to say, you know, as an exercise in revealing the gap actually between the rich and the poor, and merely, you know, the enjoyment that the ruling class have in the destruction of everybody else. We have to kind of think about it in libidinal terms. You know, what is their desire? You know, their desire to hide, you know, but they're having fun. Like, they have all the stuff, they have all the drugs, they have all the sex. You know, if we think that's fun, I mean, but I'm not saying don't have fun. I mean, I have lots of fun, but it's, but you know what I mean? Like, we can't stick it to the man by saying, like, oh, you're austere, you know, you're not doing these things. They're doing all those things, you know. Anyway, we need a better, like, libidinal analysis. But what we want to say, what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is this thing about, you know, austerity in relation to the state. Okay, so what Max, you were saying a little bit about this, you know, the good state or the welfare state, what is being destroyed in Britain, what's being explicitly destroyed, is all of those things we might have thought of as, problematically, in a Keynesian way, paternalistic, that actually did, of course, exploit periphery, that were based on theft, on colonialism, and so on. But that aspect of the state that had a sort of caring role, if you were sick, the NHS would be there, now we have, food banks, and unbelievable levels of poverty and child poverty too. And I think what then becomes important, or horribly important, is this imperative to, like as Max said, to financialize yourself, to market yourself. Those situations where people are asking for money to stay alive on the basis of their kind of social likability, that you have to kind of sell yourself as this sort of particular person or a victim and so on. And that's not even talking about, the way in which asylum seekers are being treated in the British context. So one thing that particularly stands out, I just want to say, is this, this debate over child asylum seekers. So in Britain, there were this huge call from the right to inspect the teeth of asylum seekers, in order to prove their age, right? And the British Dental Association, I love dentists, my father's a dentist, he worked for the NHS, right, and he treated people for free for years, and it's, whatever, as a side. But, the British Dental Association is not a political organisation, but they spoke out against this, the grotesque kind of biological, attempt to identify and claim that these people were not children. And I think, I don't know why I just keep thinking about who gets to be a child, in our society. Like, we have this strange combination of like infantilization, self-infantilization, but only for a few people, only a few people get to be like silly. and a lot of people don't get to be children either. They're not treated as children. If you're asylum seeker, if you're black, if you're working class, you're not really a child. You're already guilty, you're already to blame, and so on. Hang on. What do I have to stop? I should stop. What is, okay, oh gosh, okay. They are having fun. Fun for not doing that. No, I said that already. Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. Well, maybe just this final thing about decapitalism. Then I suppose it's a sort of funny idea because I wanted to. Yeah. Okay. So it's about violence. Actually, no, because okay. So on the one hand, we have to identify the violence of the system and so on, but also the way the hiddenness of it. So think about something like that gigantic trash island that's in the ocean. This kind of like effluvium, like the destruction of the world, but ends up in these kind of places, or situations where people are sort of picking through rubbish in order to kind of reclaim various elements and so on. The kind of obviously destructive quality of capitalism in the ecological sense, but also the kind of the things we don't see, like we don't look at the trash island every day, and I suppose at the same time, what does it mean then from the left to think about violence and to think about the role of counter-violence, as you said, but of revolutionary violence, and that the history of violence on the left, if you see what I mean, which often has involved a kind of decapitation of the ruling class, or at least, the idea that we can remove the head and reclaim the multitude, or, that we're the body, and the head, is parasitic on us, and we need to identify the head and cut the head off. And, I said about castration, but I think this thing about, how do we seriously conceive not just the sort of images of violence that everyone is subjected to, and some people more than others, and I talked about the workers for Facebook and others who have to filter through these kind of images of beheading in many cases, but child sexual abuse and so on, in order that we can have a nice image, a nice set of images. But also then how do we think, and maybe this relates to what Max was saying about revenge and vengeance, conceptualize our own feelings of like resentment, maybe, not just the way in which we are sort of instructed or taught in various ways to feel envy, to feel petty, to feel, alienated and isolated, but then how can we sort of turn those around, like use them against the people who are generating these images and generating these feelings, such that we can have fun, not their fun. like our fun. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nina. I think we are great. I mean, we are on time. We have 30 minutes left for a discussion. And if you allow me, I would like to start with, first of all, with a general remark, some kind of a matter of definition, and maybe ask one question, and then I would invite you to use the microphones I mentioned earlier to ask your questions. So what I was thinking about, like when listening to your very interesting and valuable inputs today, and the very different approaches, they are different, but also have some kind of a common ground, was that I think all of us today had an idea about capitalism in mind when coming here. Maybe some of us thought about the global electric grid, about no borders, I don't know, Google, Facebook, corporate authoritarianism. And what I took from your inputs actually was, and this helped me to let it sink, how complex the issue we are discussing and dealing here with today is how complex capitalism is, and how complex the repercussions are. I mean, if we start on a macro level, on the level of a global network and of financial, the power of financial players, of global players, then break it down to the personal level, as Larry and David did by showing us the film, and where we actually were able to experience to see the experience of a woman and the repercussions of this capitalist violence on her very own being. So as a political person, I think, which we all are here today, which unites us, I would like to raise the question of the prospects for some kind of a global movement that reimagines capitalism. I would like to raise the question of where the impetus for such a movement could come from. I mean, which role could social classes or spaces that Fanon probably would have described as zones of non-being could play in that global reimagination? What kind of human being would be presupposed in order to create such a movement? And obviously, what kind of organization or institutionalization would need to happen to have a global impact? Anyone care to answer?
I can, but I just spoke.
Go ahead. I don't have anything.
Okay. I was thinking of something that Eva was saying yesterday in this good panel on fascism and to fascist imaginary, I suppose, in a way. And she made this point when we were thinking about the commons, and that the common is the commons are not just, in a sense, you know, what there is, resources and so on, but it's also the kind of everyday and the way, and, you know, people have also talked about the commons in terms of like, it's a practice, you know, it's not like a set of things, as it were, you know, it's a way of relating, it's a social relation. And, but I often wonder about this thing about how do we construct precisely your question, you know, that of the kind of communist internationalism, or a kind of, you know, this idea of what unites us, what we have in common, you know, forms of solidarity, you know, and I think maybe there is a sense in which we need to quantify what it is we have, you know, and whether it's in the sense of reparations and you know, what historically, you know, we have on the basis of a contingent identity, you know, the contingent existence of all of us, but really in a way to maybe make a quantitative analysis in a certain provocative way, which is to say, where is all this stuff? Like, who just like write it all down? You know, like there is this amount of money, there are these fields, there are these crops. You know, and of course those things can change. I mean, you can change nature, and so it can become more sustainable. But just to make a kind of analysis, like what does Europe have? If we want to talk about Europe as a thing, what is in Europe? And I don't know, maybe it's a very naive thought in a way, but like to quantify what is possible. So not just on an individual level, like whether you can put someone up in your spare room, like an asylum seeker or so on. You can give money away, you can do whatever. I mean, it sounds a bit like Peter Singer or something. I'm not utilitarian, but maybe in a certain way. But do you know what I mean? Just to like have this really material analysis of what there is, what we have, what we can do, what we can give, and also what the ruling class has, and that we can take, not steal, take back.
I would maybe just latch onto that I think that I really agree. I think that we need this sort of like grassroots auditing of our own powers. And I think it points to one of the limitations, just because we're transmediale, of a lot of the approaches that have been taken to, for instance, like cryptocurrencies or other allegedly benign technologies of the so-called sharing economy that in some way seek to create the system that will be used by the next evolution of capitalism. And even if it goes cloaked under the name of some other beneficial application, there's this idea that we're going to like help correct capitalism's accounting mistakes. And never sympathize with the powerful. Never, ever sympathize with the powerful. If the powerful have some problem, and it's not your job or anyone's job, unless you happen to be allied with them, to help them do their job. Anyway, I digress. All I mean to say, taking up from your point, is that like what would be much more useful, I think, would be some measure by which we could account for our own capacities for solidarity and begin to share them better than we do now with people that we won't be able to meet. And the second thing I would just say to maybe pick up on your questions, I feel like there have been all of these attempts throughout. There's like a counter-history of globalization and a counter-history of anti-capitalism that lies underneath. We were talking a little bit before about the non-aligned movement or pan-Africanist movements or pan-indigenous movements throughout the America. There's the World Social Forum that gets together still every year and talks about, this question about how are we going to build the coalition that is going to finally defeat capitalism. I don't know what's going to work. I think we just have to kind of keep kicking at it, and yeah.
What about the role of media in this? Maybe, I mean, you, David and Larry, try to create a space in which a reimagination, and maybe also a violent reimagination, could take place. Maybe, because I mean, the movements you have mentioned, Max, are obviously very important, and also a manifestation of the fact that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. As you said, we just have to maybe go back in history and also see the forms of resistances that people, like within the Pan-Africanist or non-alignment movement, have already elaborated on. But in times of racialized technologies, in times of media, what do you think the role of media could be here?
First, I just wanted to go back to the previous question and think about, because Nina, you were talking about the libidinal power of capitalism, and I think in a way that's kind of the crux of the problem, is that people like wanting stuff and want the next thing, and it's become an incredibly powerful imaginary tool. Why do so many poor people vote for the Republicans? It's because they dream that they will be those rich people. It's as simple as that on a kind of day-to-day level. And then how do we break that cycle and provide essentially a separate libidinal subject for, rather than the wanting of stuff or the wanting of security? But Larry, you were whispering in my ear about the media stuff. So why don't you go on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think
Yeah, not that I think, you know, every artist has to go and make a Finding Funnel project, but no, but I guess what was really kind of at the core of that of communities, particularly those that are, you know, misrepresented, underrepresented, impoverished, and so on, is through utilizing technologies and being able to share stories, being able to tell stories where otherwise they won't be told. You know, it's not about waiting for, I don't know, whether it's BBC, The Guardian, or whoever to be able to tell those stories. It's about being able to kind of band together with that. I think that's something that we found between ourselves very quickly. I mean, as far as our practice goes, like, we're not usually in the same kind of physical space like much, you know. It's only when we travel, like being out here, for example, David being miles away, I don't travel to see him much. Sorry, it's just like that. But, but using, you know, the likes of WhatsApp and so on, and thinking about those types of strategies when you bring that over to the likes of you know, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and so on. That's how these stories that have been silent have been able to kind of get out there. So perhaps it's in recognizing the potentials of technology. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it is simply just the technological thing that will kind of allow us or help us. It's the people at the on the ground level that bring that forward, but utilizing that which exists already in order to get those stories out there, I think is really an important thing. Without that, we're in big trouble.
Thank you very much. I think we already have the first question in the audience. Do I see that correctly? Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This has been a really interesting panel with all the different perspectives. And I have a question that relates back to the link you made in the first presentation, Max, between settler colonialism and private property. And this relates to one of my favorite fairy tales. We're in the land of the Grimm brothers, which has very grim stories, but also one particular favorite of mine, which is the story of stone soup. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's just very briefly, it's two people traveling and they're hungry. They come to a village. They ask, do you have anything to eat? People say, no, we don't have anything. And so they said, okay, we'll make stone soup. And they go to they ask for a pan, so they do get a pan. They take stones, put it in this pan, and go to the river, put some water in, start a fire, and people are curious. They think, stone soup, is that going to be any good? And they come, and they're sitting there, so good. And if we just had a carrot, someone says, well, I've got a carrot, you know. It's really no problem. No, if we just had an onion, it would be so much better. And they slowly sort of manipulate, really, the people to give and share, and they all have soup. It's not like they kept it for themselves. I was thinking about these kind of, you know, this is also sort of a debt situation almost, to manipulate or trick people into a different logic of sharing. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on, you know, the fantasies of breaking with private property or sharing economies or things like this that are perhaps not just Uberifying everything, but, you know, these platform economies that maybe have a different kind of potential for breaking with this violent imagination.
Thanks. Yeah, and maybe other panelists also have some examples here. I don't have a ton of great examples. I would say that from the perspective that I'm trying to develop, I try and understand capitalism as a pathologically destructive format for human cooperation. And maybe more broadly than that, a pathologically destructive format for human and more than human cooperation. It's a method of orchestrating our creative energies together. And so it does have a lot to do, I think, with that fairy tale, what the fairy tale warns us about and also promises us, that, you know, people individually don't think they have the materials to make the soup, but actually, if there's some force that orchestrates them together, they do. The case with capitalism, though, is that the person who's like coming and orchestrating it just takes all the soup and everyone else gets nothing. Or maybe, you know, they get the soup, one of the 10 people who are gathered around the kettle also get a tiny bit of soup and the other 8 get nothing, or the other 9 get nothing. And, you know, they all compete to be the one person who gets a thimbleful of soup. And so there are other ways, though, that we could have for orchestrating and organizing our social cooperation. I think at one point in history, it was very difficult for us to find methods for imagining what those other methodologies for orchestrating cooperation could be. And cooperation isn't always cooperative. It can also be really coercive in a lot of different ways. And I think we're now at the horizon where we do have like pretty amazing machines we've made ourselves that could calculate, that could in some ways audit on an ongoing basis our powers, our collective powers to create life for ourselves and help us distribute the fruits of that. I would say more generally, without pointing to specific examples, that if one were to start trying to speak to that technology, as many of you in the room do, and I have no idea how to do it, I would start by asking the most deepest fundamentalist questions about how we orchestrate cooperation, now not only with just humans and more than humans, things we used to call nature, but also now with these intelligences which are emerging. I think there's just a real need to take it very slowly and ask very, very fundamental questions about how we create ourselves and our environment as a cooperative species before we rush into doing what sounds good or what feels like it might be good. Because as we know, the system of capitalism has a very adept way of getting into our imaginations and shaping them in ways that we don't really are not aware of. And the final thing I'll say about that is that's not a work any of us can do alone. We don't think alone, we don't imagine alone. Those of people who are coding and designing these new systems need to put themselves in dangerous situations of solidarity with people who are being violently oppressed and take direction from people who understand what this system does and what it's capable of. Because otherwise, you will find yourself after some years, no doubt, working for a person you don't want to be working for.
Would you like to say something, or should we take the next question? Mm-hmm. Okay, then please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to go back to that idea that you raised right at the beginning around counter-violence. And Larry and David, I haven't seen your work, but something like Grand Theft Auto, which is a misanthropic game of sorts, and I can't help, when you were speaking about it, thinking about the London riots and the looting that went along with that, and again, connecting to what Nina was talking about as a kind of libidinal pleasure or to that. And just maybe how, maybe what your projects are doing contribute to another kind of political imagination, or are then in itself subsumed by, you know, I guess the sort of financial violence that we're talking about as well. So around the libidinal analysis of something like gaming and hacking into a game engine as well as a kind of pleasure.
Yeah, I think we mentioned it in our presentation, but I think it's important to say that, you know, when we worked with various communities, we weren't like, hey, let's go and play some Grand Theft Auto, let's go and shoot down some people. You know, it was a very important, I guess, set of points where we disabled all of those functions, and we thought, okay, what's the really important thing in this game that we kind of see that just kind of gets overlooked most of the time? Maybe you'll see it in YouTube videos, is this ridiculous sublime, this ability to just walk forever. And it's like you're just having these constant conversations. So by being able to disable some of those things, we were able to start a conversation that I think, in a way, those who participate on the project and bring their voices forward will be able to take wherever it is that they wanted. So it's not really about us directing that, it's about them kind of directing us. We turn ourselves, in a way, I guess, into technicians. We know how certain things work, the camera views, etc., etc. They really kind of tell us how, I don't know, the avatar works and so on. And so I think that's the thing with gaming, is that for those who don't really kind of understand it and probably think, oh, you know, it's just like sports games, FIFA or Call of Duty, people getting shot all the time. There is something really, I can't even find the word for it, that allows people to connect and have conversations almost instantly, or even share experiences, even the experiences that David and I have shared. I mean, we haven't known each other that long, it's maybe 4 to 5 years now, right? But through having, I don't know, killed Ganondorf on The Legend of Zelda, we're able to kind of talk about those different angles or approaches to that same point. Right, so I think through kind of taking these models of said games, that obviously they are from a massive kind of capitalist backdrop, you know, Grand Theft Auto is one of the biggest selling games of all time, but there is still this potential to be able to actually, you know, hack away or break that down and then, I guess, utilize what is left, rather than, okay, let's get the character high or crash your car.
Yeah, I mean, there's an intensely pleasurable affect of just controlling a character on a screen, which is sort of, I guess, you know, I guess it's similar to, I don't know, watching a film, but you're able to control the protagonist and things like this. And I think, and there is a certain kind of, you know, parallel with the structure of something like Grand Theft Auto, which is, you know, the idea is that you accumulate capital in order to become like kind of ridiculously uber wealthy. But you know, you hear stories of people playing the game in order to, yeah, I went home every night and I would just swim for 2 hours. Like swimming in swimming pools and in the sea, like and it kind of, you know, almost subverting this form. It becomes a space in which you can have your own different conversations, which is what we created. You can create a private online space in which you kind of use it not as a space for killing each other, but as a kind of another form of Skype or something, you know?
Yeah, and it's kind of, there's a kind of funny angle to that at the same time, because yeah, in order for us to actually get there, we did have to level up. We had to make loads of money, we had to kill, and we got killed quite a lot as well. So it's but obviously in the virtualized space, mind you, we haven't killed anyone in real life, not that I know of. But it's quite interesting even as to how we had to approach that, you know, how many like hours I had to kind of put into leveling up our characters in order to get the right suit, or, you know, yeah.
Can I just add something about the libidinal aspects of the riots? I mean, I think, yeah, this is really, really key. So obviously we had riots in England in 2011, various cities. And, you know, we had this situation, obviously, like proletarian shopping. So, you know, taking back what shouldn't be, belong to someone else in a way. And lots of people described it as like the best day of their life. And there was a situation about day 2 or 3 of the riots where England like ran out of police. Like there weren't enough police. And it was brilliant. And everyone was like, oh fuck. Because you think it's like this structure, you think it's like, you know, there's an infinity of police because the state is this sort of infinite thing that's always there. But actually they ran out of police. Do you remember that? Yeah, it was brilliant. And like suddenly just this moment of like realization where actually, hang on, you know, of course the police are contingent historical thing, you know, we don't need them, we don't, you know, we haven't always had them, but, you know, because of their ideological function, you know, that we police each other, we, you know, there are fucking real police, but we also, you know, policing, and we think often in terms of punishment and punitive, you know, even when we sort of withhold conversation from somebody, you know, we're engaging in like punitive logic, you know, which we have, you know, because that's reality and that's everyday life, you know, and we internalize it. And I think identifying then the way in which desire gets like linked to these really negative forms of behavior, you know, we start to enjoy our own oppression and our oppression of other people, you know. So I think how we think about these larger structures and these inner structures in relation to ideology, like we've got to think about all the time, you know, and the riots and things like that, like really show those moments. And I just also wanted to say about cooperation and collectivity, like the models that we should be looking to were things like the plenums in Bosnia and Zagreb, you know, in the last sort of 10, 15 years, where these are sustainable daily, you know, group collective meetings where everyone comes together to talk about what is going to happen and what we're doing. And so we don't need newness all the time. You know, there are existing recent models of how to behave. And I think, you know, in the early days of the Arab Spring, this idea of that, you know, when fear changes sides, you know, that's when you can start to see things differently. And I think there are those moments in riots, and then the sustainability of something like the corporation of the plenums, you know, where fear changes sides and you're no longer afraid in a particular way. Yeah.
We do have another, I think we still have time for another last question. Okay.
So my question is for the whole panel. And I just wondering how would you propose to engage a larger population to imagine a possible future or alternative political structures apart from, like, alternative to capitalism? Because, for example, like a racism, I never experienced anything when I was back in my home country, but only when maybe I read about it from literature or stuff, but only when I moved to Europe, then as an Asian woman, then you have certain experience. However, this kind of experience is very subtle or even hidden. It may not have the values for a newspaper. And also, I know that some a group of excellent artists doing speculative design. They're trying to imagine possible futures. So there are artworks such as films or installations or objects, artifacts to be produced, but they are normally in the gallery. So it's like for a very small amount of people, also normally with high education background. So my question is just how to make some real, bring some real awakeness in people. For example, is it because maybe some public art program in big museums, or in education program, maybe introduce multiple cultures, or So just my question, wondering how to do some real stuff.
Totally with you. I agree. I think as much as it's great to be here, I don't think that, revolution's going to go down inside of an institution. It's just not, just through the actual word itself, institution. It's held behind closed doors. It's kind of private, even if it is a public space, right? And I even now, one of the things I notice about galleries is that it does, that, the way that a lot of them kind of work, they try to, they attract a certain audience, as it were, whether that's, very, very white, very male, very, prevalent and whatnot. So I think almost automatically the answer certainly isn't going to be in showing some really interesting thing within a space. It's about how these ideas are freed in a way that can get to as many people as possible. I think that's the reason why earlier on I mentioned the use of technology. The way that somebody can say something and then that can just travel like wildfire. I'm not sure of another way at the moment that will allow those messages to be able to travel in the way that they do. If we look, for example, at the actual, not that has to be played within a work, because I think that's already there in real life, but the visualization of the death of Eric Garner, the way that just traveled just throughout the world, but understanding as well that it's not something that all of a sudden happened recently. It's been happening, right? But how do you get that explanation, that understanding across? I think sharing those stories, sharing that pain is going to be important. I guess what artists have to understand is that you can't do that simply with a gallery space. There are people that just are never going to go to galleries, but it's not about trying to turn them around or say, oh, how do we make the gallery more, inviting or whatever. It wasn't in the first place. So then how do we therefore kind of make what we're doing work in another fashion? It's not about the people working for the work, it's about how we get out of that. I hope that makes sense.
Just very briefly, I think there are a huge multitude of different methods, and all of us who have engaged with different types of audiences know that sometimes certain things stick and sometimes they don't. I don't think there's any magical formula to it. For my part, I recently have had the opportunity to start a research lab at this new university I work at. And so one of the things we're doing, and I'm not suggesting this is particularly better than any other method, is we just part of what we do is facilitate participation in larger arts events so we can talk to and get ideas and get feedback from people. But a lot of what we do is just doing local workshops on very basic topics. We just did one on reimagining the police. We do ones on like rethinking financial literacy. And we try and go out into the community that we live in and offer these workshops along with other partner organizations that are really invested in the community. But yeah, I don't know what'll work. Things don't work and don't work and don't work, and then hopefully sometime during our life they will work.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's about sustaining the practice, and hopefully, something actually goes over, and so suddenly, you change a lot of minds rather than just a few. But yeah, you have very little control over that as an activist or an anarchist, I think.
I think actually also, of course, we do have to ask ourselves how a global reimagination can take place, but maybe if we just start like step by step, and that's actually why I like the idea of creating an avatar as like creating a human being. Maybe we should also think about how we could first of all be the change. Oh, that sounds very pathetic, but yeah, and that leads me back to my first question, to also ask ourselves which human being do we presuppose to then and together with other human beings can bring the change we are hoping for. And I would like to leave you with these very dramatic words. Thank you very much for coming, and have a great day at Transmediale.